So this video is going to be about the pre-Columbian North Americas, and what that really means is the Americas before Christopher Columbus, and honestly even a little bit after, because even after Columbus, when you start getting Europeans' initial meetings of these groups, you still kind of have a snapshot of what they were like before their arrival. So it's going to start kind of prehistory and how people had come to the Americas and the speculation and the new research going on there. But it's also going to discuss the civilizations and the groups in the Americas before Columbus and really kind of right at the time of the European arrival. So early research indicated that a number of people came across what's known as the land bridge, ultimately between, really where today is the Bering Strait, between modern Alaska and Russia. In this land bridge, really kind of, you can see the tracing right here, between North America and what is Asia. So the research showed that you have these people kind of come into North America around 12,000 years ago and ultimately slowly diffuse across the continents and down into South America. So this right here is where I'm talking about in the modern world. This map is obviously, just a world map, but I wanted to just kind of show it in relation to really how close they are together, so that during this ice age, what had happened is a lot of this seawater was anyway locked up into ice, and also it had exposed a section here where ultimately you had this ability to travel across. So that's kind of the reason why I wanted to show you this map. And as I said, they would come across into Alaska and then ultimately work their way down into North America, kind of diffusing across the North America and what's modern day America, and ultimately down into South America. So this theory is ultimately known as this Clovis model, and the reason for that is that the initial discovery of these settlements was at a site in Clovis, New Mexico, and these spear points are dating anywhere between 11,000, 12,000, maybe even a little bit further in our timeline here. And ultimately, the story is that these Mongoloids, or people of Asian descent, crossed into the Americas and began to disperse, as I was just kind of mentioning, and this group is ultimately going to become the founding population of today's modern Native Americans. This map here is just a map of the number of Clovis sites that have been discovered using this model, and this is really probably what you can consider the first kind of unique culture that had come through into North America. And this wave of immigration here absolutely happened. The question really becomes was this the first, or were there more? And as we're going to get into more research, that it's going to show that this theory is going to be questioned. So I just want to show you right up here, this white area and gray area is ultimately where, we're pretty sure that the ice from this ice age, was around this time period, so 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. And you can see the kind of the opening that allowed, and you can see the early settlements here, and ultimately these larger groups of these settlements and findings for this Clovis group are all around the country. So that new research and new discoveries we talked about, obviously we read the article in class that talked about some of these settlements dating, pre-Clovis. And, what's happening is now all of a sudden people are finding things that are disrupting this original Clovis theory. And when these things are dated, they're actually finding that some of these things are as much as 15,000 or even more, years ago. And this is thousands of years before what was known as the Clovis model. So the fact that this predates the glacial recession and the melt that allowed people kind of really to be able to get down into North America, this was a really big deal. And what's happening is, as more evidence is found, these things people couldn't really ignore this anymore. And ultimately, it allowed them to begin digging deeper into some of these Clovis sites and realizing that when they dug deeper, they actually found other artifacts that dated even, longer before this Clovis model. So when you throw in DNA evidence and things like that, it actually became evident that there were there's a much more diverse population in the Americas at this time period. So the article we read talks about three distinct populations, and we're not 100% sure where they came from, but some of the leading theories anyway, and again, this is speculation at this point, we're not really 100% sure, and that's the problem with prehistory. A lot of it is speculation based off of what we can find, and these are just thoughts, and these can easily be debunked, 20 years, 30 years down the line with more research. But as of right now, there is some thought that you actually have potential groups of Europeans that had made it over, along a similar kind of ice, along the ice in the North Atlantic, following potential walruses. You also have a theory where you have these Pacific Island type people, Polynesians and Papua New Guinea and Australian type people that had made their way down into there, kind of hopping their way across the Pacific and ultimately into South America. And that's evident by some DNA that we have found in some relatives, some ancestors of these people that have some of this DNA in them. So it really becomes interesting, and we're really, when it comes down to it, we're not really 100% sure where the first people came from. We're pretty sure of where some people have come from, but it's gonna require a lot more research and a lot more hopeful, findings, archaeological findings, and things like that. So we're going to be skipping quite a bit in time at this point, and we're going to be talking about the civilizations of the Americas, and really some of the groups that were here on the eve of the European discovery. So I wanted to kind of give you the heads up of some of these groups that are for sure were here and had a play, and they were a larger group than this idea that the Americas were kind of largely uninhabited, and also that the humans here had little kind of effect on their actual surroundings. So the first is these ancient Olmecs, which were a group that had grown up in Mexico and come along in Mexico, and from there you have the Maya, which were around early BC and even into AD, and they would even be around during the Cortez and the conquest of Mexico, at least culturally anyway. Next you get the Aztecs, which were a major, large civilization in Mexico when Cortez and the Spanish showed up in Mexico, and the Incas as well, which were an even larger civilization that were in South America when Pizarro would come in and ultimately conquer for the Spanish. Additionally, you had other North American tribes that were in the Americas, in North America, that especially modern day America, and these people were not just sitting around in small bands like what had previously once been thought. This is a map of what's known as Mesoamerica. So really this is Mexico and Central America and the groups that had existed here before the European arrival. So if you can see, in this orange right here where my pointer is kind of highlighting, this is kind of where what would be considered Olmec populations had existed. And ultimately, the Olmecs would kind of influence what would become modern, or not modern, but Mayan civilization. And the Mayans would be kind of take up shop right here on the Yucatan. And we're going to go more into the Mayans, and you obviously went into them in class as well. But this is a group that had developed their own writing system. They had, very specific farming practices and cultural practices, quite good builders. Chichen Itza, which you're going to see in a second here, came from, these Mayan populations as well. So, this is a group that it's again, not this picture that had once kind of existed of the Native Americans that were here. And then you also get the Aztecs, which we're going to get into just again in a second, which were a much more advanced civilization, creating beautiful major cities that in many cases were more populated and in some cases even more advanced than certain European cities. And they had their own distinct culture, obviously, and they were a major group with millions of people. And that millions of people is a big deal because you have now, estimates in the Americas of 50, 60, and even at the upper estimates of like 100 million people here. So again, this idea of a largely uninhabited North America with Native Americans just kind of living off of land and communally living off the land is we're kind of departing from that and we're moving forward to a more forward thinking where these people had a significantly larger impact on their environment. The Aztecs, again, which were located in central Mexico, were a large hegemonic group, and they were an extremely advanced group, as I was kind of just mentioning. Their estimated population was around 15 million people, and their capital city is really a beautiful example of the type of technological feats that these people were actually capable of. It's currently Mexico City today, but the story goes, and there's a video here from the PowerPoint that when you go to it explains the story of how this city was created, and really quickly, ultimately, they had found an island in the middle of this pretty big lake, Lake Texcoco in Mexico, and they started building on it, and ultimately when they needed more room to build, they actually expanded this island. They would basically drive in stakes and rocks and things like that around the perimeter of the island and fill that in with earth, and they lashed these stakes and things together to make a barrier that they could put more earth in, and ultimately they kind of slowly expanded the island until it was a bit larger, a lot larger really, where they could then build significantly larger on. Another really cool thing, and you're going to see that in a second, was that they had created these kind of canals through the city, similar to what you might see in Venice, where they would be able to travel through kind of main areas of the city using typically canoes. The Aztecs were ultimately conquered by a man named Hernan Cortez, who was a Spanish conquistador in 1519, and we talked about him a little bit more in class, and you did a homework on him. But these Aztecs were really quite an incredible people. So this is an artist rendering of this capital, Tenochtitlan, on Lake Texcoco in central Mexico. So you can see, here where my pointers are going, you have these kind of canals going through the city where these canoes could come. You had these giant causeways, they're called, basically bridges that would allow you to get into, onto the city via land if you needed to. And you had these big, elaborate temples and pyramid type structures, in the city as well. So these people were really proficient builders. They, were good engineers, and they were really quite an incredible group. It's just that their practices, in comparison to some of the European practices at the time, were considered a little barbaric. You had things like human sacrifices from their religions and such. So their government, the Aztec government, was ultimately broken down into tributary city-states. So what would happen is you would had groups of these Aztecs ultimately conquer these nearby cities, which were city-states essentially in a very similar fashion to what you had with the Greeks, and they were known as Altepetl. And each of these city-states had their own dynastic rulers, dynasties, which is a family ruled, and their own kings. And essentially what would happen is this group, this Aztec Triple Alliance, came together and they would take control of these city-states, and they would more or less leave them with autonomy. They could kind of operate how they wanted to, as long as they paid tribute to the Aztecs and to the emperor of the Aztecs and and to the Aztec state. So they were left alone largely, which really didn't they were okay with. It didn't really foster too much resentment if the states were allowed to practice, their own rituals and beliefs in certain cases, which were mostly the similar. But, if a group comes in and conquers and allows the people to operate more or less the same, then, they're not going to be so upset with it typically. It's when the groups come in and change everything up and change all of their ways that they get really, really upset. So this map is a map of the provinces really around the Aztecs. And, as you can see here, this is kind of the main capital area. You have the Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and such around Lake Texcoco. And this is where these people kind of expanded outwards, and you can see all these little kind of city-states around in the area highlighted in red. You can see this, and these are the groups that were ultimately being conquered and forced to pay tribute and such to the Aztec. We're moving on to the Incas now. The rest of the stuff that you would need to know about the Aztecs and the Conquest, we ultimately, looked at in that web quest we did for class. But moving on to the Incas, this is a map of the Incan Empire at the time of the Spanish conquest in 1532. So their empire extended really a large distance. This is the largest territorial empire, prior to the conquests, and this was people's, a number of people. They're not 100% sure, but anywhere, I've seen estimates between 4 and 30 million or so. Here it says 12 if you look down over on the little text there. This is a group where you have lots of different languages. It's kind of lots of different cultures. Again, kind of had been conquered and brought into this what we're calling the Inca Empire. It's a large empire. It extends about 2,500 miles between modern-day Ecuador, through Peru, down into the Andes Mountains, and ultimately in modern-day Chile. And it's a really big group, and they have their own technological feats as well in comparison to the Aztecs. And one of the reasons for their conquest is ultimately going to be the seclusion of the mountains. If you look closely here, I can zoom in, you can see kind of the mountains and the mountain structure here, really at the tip, of Central America going into South America, in the mountains, the Andes Mountains here, which is modern-day Panama, down into Colombia. You can see all these mountains, and this group is ultimately going to evolve their way of life around living high up in the mountains. So as I had just mentioned, the Inca Empire stretched roughly 2,500 miles between modern-day Ecuador, Peru, and through modern-day Chile. So the empire was mostly in the highlands of the Andes Mountains, and these people ultimately needed to adapt to those mountains' geographical features to be able to develop their farming and ultimately irrigation to help feed the farming. And the way they did that is they ultimately cut terraces into the mountains, which you're going to see just in a second here. And those terraces allowed them to plant their crops. So here you can actually see those terraces. In any of these pictures, I'll look at this one first where I'm kind of circling with my mouse. So you can see how these flat little sections ultimately are where they planted the crops. And these were carved into the mountain, and what's really interesting about this is that these people didn't have the beasts of burden that the Europeans and the Eurasians did have. There were no cattle or anything like that to be able to pull a plow, or horses or anything like that. So all of the work for this was done by hand by these people, using hand tools and such. And that's really what makes this so much more impressive, because even today this would be, quite an impressive feat. And, this was done thousands of years ago by people and just their hands. You can see other examples just of these terraces here. And then ultimately this picture on the right is a picture of Machu Picchu, which was ultimately believed to be an agricultural hub for the Incas, a long, long time ago too. So the Incas were also conquered by the Spanish, and it was done by a man named Francisco Pizarro, and he took one kind of out of the book of Cortez, and his conquest was kind of similar to Cortez's in a way. Luckily for Pizarro, as I kind of mentioned, the Incas were geographically isolated in these mountains, so they were left largely naive of the conquest in Mexico by the Spanish. And if they had known about it, it's very likely this would have gone a very different way. But the fact that they didn't know, and the fact that such a small group of Spaniards came in, this group, the Incas that were a large empire that had a large military and such, weren't really scared of them. It allowed the Spanish to kind of get the upper hand and surprise them and ultimately capture the Emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca. And we watched the video Guns, Germs, and Steel, in class, and it kind of really highlights this. But ultimately, you have this group of 160 or so Spaniards, coming into this region, and again, very similar to Cortez, they are able to kind of gather some support of locals that weren't so happy with the Incas. But when they came into to meet the emperor, ultimately they were pretty much by themselves, and they were brought to this town known as Cajamarca, and ultimately, at the meeting with the emperor, you have the Spanish ultimately trying to convert these people to Christianity and at least show them the way. And the story goes, that they showed Atahualpa the Bible, and there were insults, possibly due to language barriers. He potentially threw the book, as you kind of saw dramatized in the video anyway. And from there, the Spanish took this as a majorly upsetting to them, and you get this attack by the Spanish in a sort of surprise way against this group of Incas that were not really ready for it, and the shock and awe of their muskets mixed with the attack of the horse charge really led to a major rout where you have only a couple 160 or so of these Spaniards killing a very large number of these Incas in a full-out attack. Basically, as they're running away in fear, the Spanish just kind of run them down on the horses and just keep slaughtering kids, women, men, with very little resistance. And it's not that there wasn't any resistance, because you would like to think that when you have that much of a number superiority, that they could possibly do something against it. But again, fear takes over in situations like that, and because of the Spanish technologies, where you have the guns, the really sharp swords, the iron and such, you really have potentially no Spanish casualties, but there are some sources that do say, a few Spanish casualties as well. So we're not really 100% sure, because the records are what they are. But so when it comes down to it, a small band of Spaniards ultimately came and conquered this group and captured the emperor, very similarly to Cortez, and were able to use the emperor to kind of then take control of the state as well, and also continue fighting with the allies that they had gotten from on their way up to these higher areas in the Inca's empire. So the question becomes, why did the Europeans have such a tremendous advantage in comparison to the Native Americans, at the time of conquest? And Jared Diamond, the man who, wrote the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, he has postulated ultimately that it really comes down to a geographical advantage that was enjoyed by the Europeans and the Eurasians ultimately, because if you look, I'm going to zoom in, the Fertile Crescent and really the cradle of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia, which is Iraq and Iran along the Tigris and Euphrates River over here. If you look at the difference between Eurasia here, where I'm circling, and then North America, Eurasia runs along a latitudinal axis here of roughly similar latitudes. And the way latitude works is, the equator, roughly where I'm kind of on right now with my mouse, is ultimately, it's 0 degrees latitude, and as you go north or south, the degrees increase, and then the farther away you get from the equator, you obviously get different climate zones. So really, when you're looking at Eurasia, ultimately the climate zones are fairly similar, especially around this area where I'm circling, this Eurasian area, and because those climate zones are similar, the domesticated domesticated crops and domesticated farm animals that came out of the breadbasket here, the Fertile Crescent, they could ultimately spread to Europe and also Northern Africa and even into Asia itself, and because of that, the farming spread very well, and that spread civilization. And it wasn't just the farming; it was all ideas and technologies and things, it was very easy to move around this area through, the Mediterranean Sea. Whereas in contrast, in the Americas, you have a north to south continent here, or group of two continents, and this really had very different climate zones. So, for example, a North American group in Alaska, which may have developed around fishing and salmon and things like that in Alaska, ultimately what they've discovered and how they choose to live isn't going to really have much of an effect for them down in central Mexico. There's no salmon down in central Mexico. So these climate zones developed very distinctly different peoples that really couldn't build and work off of each other too much. And those climate zones also really led to some major natural barriers as well that just didn't allow this easily spread and diffusion of ideas that you got in Eurasia. Going even further into the topic, the Europeans, by living amongst those farm animals we were just talking about, they were around these animals where many diseases and such came from. They would kind of originate in these animals, and then they would mutate to be able to spread to humans. So, humans evolved in these areas around these diseases, and ultimately they weren't really as affected by them. They had developed immunities, and when this ice broke, and this was now isolated. These people in the Americas were isolated from Europe and Asia and such. They had very different experience when the people came into the Americas. There were some large mammals that were potentially domesticatable, but supposedly what happened is these people were so quick and such good hunters that they actually are responsible for really an extinction event of these animals, and that before they would have developed and been able to domesticate these animals were more or less extinct. So there were very few domesticatable animals in the Americas, and as a result of that, they didn't necessarily live in close proximity to these animals and didn't develop their own diseases that might have gone the opposite direction, to Europe and to Eurasia once there had been contact made. And those diseases that came over with the initial Europeans are actually responsible for killing really 90% or more of the estimated Native American population in the Americas after that initial contact. We're talking millions and millions of people being dead between the initial contact and when the next major wave of English colonies and such in the New World. Our last little stop here for this little unit is dealing with the Maya. And, we really did something in class that goes a lot more in detail into them than I'm going to go here. But the Maya, were before the Aztecs and the Incas, so I probably should have put this before. But they were, centered in really Central America and in the Yucatan. And they were in these tropical lowlands here, and they reached their peak, around 600 AD. You can see right down here Chichen Itza, which is one of these beautiful temples and beautiful pyramids that they were able to build. They excelled at agriculture, growing corn and things like that. They had their own religion. They actually had written language, which was a big thing back then, especially for this, and it developed independently of any influence from elsewhere in the world, which is really interesting as well. And this culture would kind of ultimately carry on until the Spanish conquest. In fact, some of the people that Cortez met when he was coming into the Yucatan were you probably could still consider them some of Mayan influence, but the peak of this group, ended a lot earlier than that. So the other extra details for, Maya, make sure to check out the jigsaw activity that we did in class.